Our next presentation is being made by Lisa Stevens. Lisa is a lecturer in industry health and safety consultant with the School of Science here at RMIT University. Lisa's got the privilege of probably having the best named presentation, TB or not TB, a lifetime of racing MGs, which is a reflective look at Tom Stevens' 7 decades of involvement in motorsport and the automotive industry and the challenges to preserving his legacy. Tom is obviously Lisa's dad. So please welcome Lisa Stevens.
Thank you. What I hope to do in the next 20-25 minutes is condense 90 years of life and a career of motor racing that spans some 70 years, which in 20 minutes is probably going to be a mean feat. But unlike some of his contemporaries, there are no books, no websites, no wiki pages dedicated to his life and achievements. There were no world records, no formal accolades, yet, like many, he is best described as one of the personalities of motor racing in the pre- and post-war era. Tom Stevens was involved in motorsports for nearly 70 years. He was a sports administrator, historian, mechanic, restorer of cars, a fuel or lubricant specialist, team manager and racing driver. So who was he? Born in South Australia in 1919 from immigrant parents. His father was a motor bodybuilder. Attended Woodward Central College, which is a technical college in Adelaide, and did his apprenticeship. Just as war began, he was in the midst of his apprenticeship with the Commonwealth Oil Refinery, COR. By the age of 24, he had enlisted in the Australian Imperial Forces and served in Papua New Guinea in the 1st 13th Field Regiment, then to small boats before being promoted to warrant officer, 2nd class, 31st War Transport. Come to the end of the war in the Pacific, Tom not only successfully completed vehicle and maintenance course training, but he'd become one of the instructors. By 1946, he'd rejoined COR, BP, as a consultant in fuel and lubricants. Despite the intervening years, he would enjoy a racing career that spanned from the 1930s to 2003. As a sports administrator, he'd become CAM's steward in 1957, CAM's councillor representing South Australia in 1959, and in 1956, he and long-term friend and on-track rival Steve Tillett would become the founding vice presidents of the MG Car Club of South Australia. It is probably easier to list the tracks that he didn't race on, and I'm not sure that is a full list. The street circuits of Loberthal, South Australia, Victor Harbour in South Australia, along with Port Wakefield, hold many memories. With some of the Australian states banning road circuits, more purpose-built tracks were established. Today, very few of these tracks remain operational. His knowledge of the tracks, drivers and cars, and event race results could not be equalled. His collection of photographs and programs will paint a picture of pre- and post-war racing. The images of gentlemen leaning against the side of a car, smartly dressed, wearing berets and peak caps and cravats, presented a romantic side to car racing. In Tom's case, it was his trademark white cotton overalls, a roughly fashioned fiberglass racing helmet and a pair of stringback gloves, and his prized imported Polaroid driving goggles that made him stand out from other drivers. On the other hand, a newspaper description of South Australia's most successful female racing driver, Miss Judy Racker, conjures an image that could only be described as Gatsby-esque. These items are a far cry from the fire retardant racing suits and helmets that are required by the rules set down by CAMS and FIA. On the other hand, the same photographs show the safety measures were rudimentary at best. Hay bales were used either as safety barriers or to delineate a course. Unlike today's racetracks, there was very little separating spectators and drivers. Corners were sharpened and tracks resurfaced to improve speed. Track makeovers were newsworthy items. The racetracks of today have come a long way. High cyclone safety debris fences separate spectators from the track. Tyre walls, rumble strips and run-off areas have been designed and installed to help protect the driver in the event of an accident. The words scientific, meticulous, technical, immaculate were adjectives regularly used to describe not only his driving but the preparation of his cars. In an article on South Australia's most successful MGTC, the reader was reminded that any car would have to meet those exacting standards before it was scrutinised, re-scrutinised, before being stripped down and rebuilt within an inch of its life. Catastrophic failures were rare, although Tom does describe one event where the car suffered a broken stub axle, resulting in the separation of one of the front wheels. Tom's ability to slow down and stop was severely hampered with the loss of the hydraulics. Having managed not only to avoid spectators and other objects, he received a minor injury when getting out of the car. He hit his hip on a post. The wheel, having bounced over the fence, was duly returned to him by a spectator. And it just reminds us that these accidents still happen, yet the separation in those times was very little. Despite this rare incident, the preparation of his cars was hung up. His last MG&TF received many accolades for both its turnaround and performance. Not only did Tom's car look as if they'd come off the showroom floor, but their ability to perform was never questioned. This was the reputation that led car enthusiasts to his front door, or rather the back shed. When it came to restoration work, he was a good friend to have. The concept of female racing drivers was not particularly novel at that time. We had internationally Maria Antonietta Avanzo, Maria Teresa de la Filipises, and Patricia Moss Carlson. In Australia, post-war female drivers included Miss Judy Rackham, Miss Betty Corbin, Miss Nancy Barlow, Miss A. Wild, and of course, Miss A. Davison. Yet, being comfortable racing against women, it was a different story when it came to dispose of his MGTF. The idea of his daughter racing his beloved MGTF was a step too far. Tom's relationship with BP, or COR, had started pre-war with his apprenticeship and ended in retirement. War service had enhanced both the depth and breadth of his knowledge. One would suggest that Tom's employment with COR BP was, using the vernacular, was a marriage made in heaven, although Tom would probably not see it in those terms. While much of his time was spent undertaking field trials, working with car and marine dealerships and the sales marketing scene, it seemed Tom was in his element. He had access to research laboratories, up-to-date information from Europe, and the ability to make connections beyond the shores of Australia. Field car trials would give him credibility and a profile beyond the city limits, as having people of Tom's calibre driving into rural centres was big news. The local town hall presentations to service station owners, mechanics, rural car dealerships and racing enthusiasts connected the big snow to rural areas. One has to remember that this was at a time when communication technology at its best was rudimentary, and it took several weeks, if not months, to get from one side of the world to the other. Tom was one of a number of contract drivers to BP. His contemporaries include some of pre- and post-war motor racing royalty, and we see the names here of Davison, Stillwell, Tillett, Braden, Jones, Norman, Molina, Jolly, Snow, and Miss Judy Rackham. His association with the late Gary Cooper in ELFIN was one that would go beyond that of technical advice and management and continued after Gary's untimely death. Tom was there when the ELFIN Formula J made its debut at Warwick Farm in 1961 when it was driven by Arnold Glass. The journey from 1 Camara Avenue, Edwardstown to Warwick Farm was one of extraordinary effort which saw an unraced, untried race car compete on equal terms with some of the best cars in that category at the time. And this photo was taken the night before they left to Sydney. Tom's notebooks record the various settings for the Warwick Farm and the Australian Grand Prix event in which the FJ was entered. Details of the FJ's successful debut were subsequently reported to BP's head office in London. By the time they returned, the team of Gary and Cliff Cooper, Murray Lewis and Tom had completed our 1,800-mile round trip, and it was miles when it was reported. To race a car that not previously been driven on a track, but I think the records show that it actually had only been started up for about 15 minutes in the shed. There was talk of increasing the team strength to 3 cars. The team would comprise of a Ford engine FJ, a 1500cc BMC powered sports racer, and a new Clubman style on the Lotus 7 line to be powered by Tom's 1.25 litre low-style modified MG motor with Thomas the driver. Further reports to BP head office mentioned the work being done by Gary Cooper and Tom's BP colleague Keith Ralston, fitting a 1500 Cortina motor into the prototype ELFIN Mono Racer. The Mono made its debut in 1964. Gary's Cooper's untimely death brought Tom's project management skills to the fore. He, like many others, saw the need to pay tribute to a man whose South Australian built cars would have an impact on the international motor racing stage. He was one of a number of people working closely with Cliff and Lorraine Cooper to ensure that a proper tribute was paid to Gary. Tom was instrumental in the development of the Gary Cooper Memorial Trust, seeking sponsorship and rallying people to develop a suitable tribute to a man and the cars. This display was eventually opened in 1989 at the Burwood Mill Motor Museum. But Tom had other involvements. An envelope with the words protein specs for engine inhibitors DTD 44D was destined for the recycling bin, if not for the recognition as one word. It is these sort of ad hoc notes written on the back of envelopes that help piece together one person's involvement in the most historic automotive events of the 1960s, the Campbell Land Speed record. A letter to a colleague in London outlined not only the collaboration between BP and Dunlop in collecting tyre surface and adhesion test data, but saw Tom being invited to make himself ready as the driver of the Jaguar XK150 test car. History subsequently reveals that Dunlop technician and Bluebird project Andrew must have completed the test in an ELFIN Catalina. Tom kept copious notebooks detailing everything from different racing brews, details of car setouts, results on lap times from the 1950s onwards. His comprehensive journals provided an insight to one of the biggest questions in historic motor racing, and that is a MGTA chassis number 718 a TB or not? The marriage between an MGTA chassis and the MGTC engine does not automatically equate to an MGTB. And for Tom, accuracy of fact was paramount. This, of course, led to the inevitable letter war between himself and the CAM's National Historic Committee. But the ramifications for the eligibility committees is profound, if authoritative references which continue to contribute to misinformation. As a go-to man, he was a catalyst for settling many disputes. Tom was sent a number of manuscripts and galley proofs to which there were attached the obligatory, "It would be appreciated if you could have a look at this," or a first edition copy would arrive with a letter attached of thanks. Even motoring writer Graham Howard realised that despite the scrupulous checking of facts, that there was not only gaps in the available information, but that errors could still be made, and the potential for those errors to be replicated was quite high. It is unclear whether or not his chapter on the 1955 Grand Prix was ever revived. His collection of race reports, lap times and other data would provide an invaluable source for automotive historians and authors, although Tom questioned whether or not generations X, Y and Z will have the same affinity for collectible cars and the history as their parents and grandparents. Despite this meticulous and pedantic nature, he failed in one of the most basic areas of record keeping. There was no way to identify many of the photographs. There was no reason for him to write on these photographs because he had great recall of memory, except for when somebody else goes to look through them. Notes were found in old books, jottings on the backs of envelopes, duplicate photographs, unidentified photographs, fragile and fading documents, which I'm wondering how many ways you can actually photograph a car and a car engine. But there are some 60 private and public motor museums in Australia which serve both public and private interests, along with hundreds of car clubs covering nearly every type and vintage of car ever made. Car clubs face the biggest challenge of physical and financial resources. So while there are car clubs who are interested in collections like these, they don't have the physical or financial resources to be able to manage it. But it's also not just about having space, about having the ability to preserve the information and having people who are willing to look after it and undertake research. But these collections are also represent a family legacy, something to be handed down to generation. No matter what that case is, it is important that these records do not end up in the recycling bin or in landfill. In the case of Tom's collection of papers and photographs, they will be sorted through and they'll be catalogued and digitised as much as possible. In Tom's case, the forthright approach and rejection of the spotlight made him less likely to be honoured in an informal sense, yet the level of respect he achieved as a driver, a fuel lubricant specialist and a motorsport historian was enough. It seems the Australian public attributes success to elite sporting levels as being an individual's contribution to the fabric of sport and as to Australia as a nation. But it must be remembered that not everyone can come first, not everyone ends a successful racing career to go on a top flight sports administrator. Yet everyone who participates in sport in their own way contributes to the development and the profile of sport. It's important to remember that motorsport in Australia was in its infancy when Tom first took to the track. This came from a number of his colleagues, and I think it's the best document I've seen that has been able to describe Tom. It is very hard to describe Tom Stevens. But to one, historic motor racing legends, living treasures, from Victor Harbour in 1936 to Loberthal in 1939, Bathurst in 1952 to racing MGs, TCs in the 1950s, often support in the 60s, the Bluebird record attempt surveys in the 60s, historic racing in the 80s. In fact, Tom continued racing into the next millennium. Nearly 70 years, a lifetime racing in MGs.
Thank you, Lisa. Does anybody have any questions? I'm sure we've got time for one or two. Anybody? I noticed that one of the comments that was made was about the propensity of collections to end up in rubbish skips. It's amazing. Just, I think all of us here at some stage have probably experienced exactly that. We've recovered stuff that has been thrown out. We were recently fortunate enough to actually, it's a lead into Helen's next talk about Harley Tarrant, to have a complete photo album from 1921 of the Tarrant Motor Company that was literally recovered from a rubbish bin and handed to the Veteran Car Club, the owner not knowing what it was, for us to nearly fall over. It's one of the only complete albums known to exist. So, any questions? Tony?
Just a bit of the history, I suppose, of your father's... Oh, thanks. Just a bit of the history, Lisa, of your father's interest with the MG marque particularly. It was very popular, obviously, as a racing car. But what was it that was particularly important to him about the MG?
It's hard to tell, because one of the problems with Tom was that he compartmentalised a lot of his life. And it's an interesting thing, particularly with people of that era, where a lot of the stuff wasn't handed down, particularly to female children, but to the son. Daughters were sort of isolated. It's interesting, old photos show there was Rileys and Austins as well as MGs. It's unclear what led him to sort of continue on to MGs, but his racing career was basically racing MGs. I know he raced other cars for other owners, but his cars were MGs. It would be nice to have more information to sort of grab hold of, but unfortunately a lot of it goes with people, you know, their intentions, their motivations and things like that. If it's not written down, it disappears.
I noticed that part of your talk was about challenges for the future about preserving these packets of pockets of information. What are your performance with the archives and records that you have?
At the moment I'm going to sit down, and I've gone through a lot of it, is to digitise it. There are discussions with the Sporting Car Club of South Australia, as well as the MG Car Club of South Australia, and seeing where it needs to go. Because one of the things for him, it was important that these collections are made available for enthusiasts, what he wanted, because of the technical nature of this and the journals of building a number of these cars, that this be available for people to review and to look at the engineering and things like that, rather than going into museums or academic libraries where, you know, there would be difficulties.
Just in talking about this gentleman being a South Australian, there might be another South Australian organisation that might have an interest in that archival material at some point down the track. Yeah, you're right, it's a problem trying to make sure that this stuff stays in public circulation. We have at the National Motor Museum the George Brooks Library, which came from well-known motoring author George Brooks, and it's a large collection, archival collection. We've just started getting into that area of collecting. It's one of the areas that we need to develop. And yes, it saddens me to hear stories of things being pulled out of rubbish tips, because it all too often happens, and it still happens. So.
And I think it's going to get worse with people storing things on computers, because I wonder how many people, how many families are going to go through hard drives and passport drives to find out what the letters are and what's there. Are they just going to be wiped, thrown out? And I guess Tom was at a time both in business and socially where you wrote letters, you kept a draft. If things were tight, they had multiple carbon copies, so there was always a copy around, whereas these days things are now getting put onto hard drives. Half people may not even know that they're there, they'll get wiped, and that's just gone.
Could I just make a comment about donating records and papers and archives and so on? I've been working in the museum field for quite a long time, a number of decades really, and I often hear people say, well, I want it to stay locally, I'm going to give it to the car club or the local historical society. And in my career, I've seen any number of these smaller organizations disappear because the mainstays who set it up in the first place, they died, they got old, they retired and so on. And then you're left with this big collection for the Queanbeyan Historical Society, and where does it go? So I'm going to suggest to you that, and for other people in this room who are interested in archives, did it go into a real archive? By a real archive, I mean an institutional archive, a museum, a university, a national library. Think twice about giving it to the local archive, which may not be there in 10 years.
It's interesting because there is a lot of places that this material can go. The problem is people about, again, how high profile was this particular person, what does it contribute to the history of motorsport and things like that. And it's quite interesting that different clubs or different organisations have a different perspective on what they will collect, because the other problem is that they are being given so much material that they have to sort and make decisions about how that fits in with their sort of agenda. So it's one of those questions, and the problem is that we do need to save it, and a lot of this stuff is actually being still kept by families.
That might be the answer.
But then,
It's the first museum with families actually keep their records.
but then you also raise the issue of access by other people and things like that. So it's an interesting ongoing conversation that people need to have. Yeah.
Thank you again, Lisa.